Conservation of genetic resources, assessing conservation status and management strategies. Conservation status can be defined as an indicator of the likelihood of a species to continue to survive either in the present day or in the future. Therefore, assessment of conservation status of species and ecosystems is to evaluate the risk that a given species is going to go extinct or a given ecosystem is likely to collapse. For species, we will assess the full species and also subspecific units. For ecosystems, ranking is conducted at multiple levels, from regional to local types. Conservation status ranks are widely used throughout the conservation community and are regarded as highly credible by scientists, government agencies, and of course private sector organizations. We looked at the various parties or people who are involved in the conservation of genetic resources. Therefore, these assessments are also a valuable resource for government agencies responsible for administration of federal, state, and provisional species conservation laws. We'll also be looking at what are the various laws that we have in the world and also at national level here in Kenya. Now, the International Union of Conservation of Nature has defined what we call a red list category, and these red list categories are a means of providing conservation status. And these red lists, usually we will have what we call an endangered species, and then we have vulnerable species, near threatened species, species of least concern, data deficient species, and not evaluated species. And then after endangered, we have now critically endangered, extinct in the wild, and finally extinct organisms. So let us look at each one of them. Now, when we say extinct, EX, a taxon is extinct when there is no reasonable doubt that the last individual has died. Okay, a taxon is presumed extinct when exhaustive surveys, of course, in known and or expected. Okay, so the habitats that we knew or those that we expect that such taxons or species will exist in at appropriate times, that is considering what are the seasons for those particular animals, diurnal, seasonal, annual, throughout its historic range, have failed to record an individual. So we look at extinction with an exhaustive survey. We check the known habitats, the expected habitats, then we also look at appropriate times for a specific taxon, then of course throughout a historic range, throughout time. We are not able to record an individual, then you can refer to that as extinct. Surveys should be over a time frame appropriate to the taxon's life cycle and life form. Even the time is considered depending on what is the taxon's life cycle and life form. That is extinct. Then we have what we call extinct in the wild, EW. So in this case, a taxon is extinct in the wild when it is known only to survive in cultivation, if it's a plant, in captivity, where it has been quarantined, or as a naturalized population or populations well outside the past range. Okay, so extinct in the wild means it is somewhere else in cultivation, captivity, or naturalized populations, but it is not existent in the wild. Naturalization is a process in ecological phenomena through which species, taxon, or population of as exotic as opposed to native origin integrates into a given ecosystem, becoming capable of reproducing and growing in it. So this is where you have put a certain taxon within a certain area and it has been able to adapt and reproduce. So a taxon is presumed extinct in the wild when exhaustive surveys in known or expected habitat again at appropriate times throughout historic range have failed to record any individual, and of course still again should be done over a time frame appropriate for the taxon's life cycle and life form. Then we have what we call regionally extinct, RE. This category for a taxon where there is no reasonable doubt that the last individual potentially capable of reproduction within that region has died or has disappeared from the wild in the region, or when, if it is a former visiting taxon, maybe it was just visiting in that ecosystem, the last individual has died or disappeared in the wild from the region. So in this case, we are looking at a particular region. So this means that we could be having this particular organism elsewhere apart from the region of evaluation. The setting of any time limit for listing under this is left to the discretion of the regional red list authority, but usually cannot predate 1500 after death. A taxon is critically endangered when the best available evidence indicates that it means any of the A to E criteria for critically endangered. We are going to be looking at the criteria of A to E, and it is therefore considered to be facing an extremely high risk of extinction into the wild. So critically endangered, it's not just endangered, because endangered on the other hand means that it meets any of the criteria A to E for endangered and therefore considered to be facing a very high risk of extinction. Okay, so this one is very endangered, means very high risk of extinction. Critically means extremely high risk of extinction, and vulnerable means that it meets any of the criteria A to E for vulnerable and therefore has a high risk of extinction into the wild. And then near threatened, a taxon that is near threatened, it has been evaluated against the criteria but does not qualify for all the others, that is critically endangered, endangered or vulnerable now, but it is close to qualifying for or is likely to qualify for threatened category in the near future. Taxons of least concern, it has been evaluated against the criteria and does not qualify for critically endangered, endangered, vulnerable or near threatened. It's widespread and abundant taxa are included in this category, widespread and abundant. So that is where we are saying when we have certain taxons that are very abundant and widespread within a vast geographical area, then they cannot be placed in terms of critical endangerment or threat because they are in abundance. So they are least of concern, so we don't worry that they could actually become an issue of loss at any point in the future. We have what we call data deficient. Data deficient, of course, even from the word, is inadequate information to make a direct or indirect assessment of its risk of extinction based on its distribution and population status. There isn't enough information about a certain taxa. So a taxon in this category may be well studied and its biology known, but appropriate data on how many they are, what's the abundance, and the distribution within a certain geographical area is lacking. So these ones, data deficient is therefore not a category of threat, of course. It just means that we don't have enough information. Listing of taxa in this category indicates that more information is required and acknowledges the possibility that future research will show that threatened classification is appropriate. Yes, because if you can't get information about the abundance and distribution, then we would have it more likely to be in a threatened classification. However, it is important to make positive use of whatever data that is available, and in many cases, great care should be exercised in choosing between DD and a threatened status. If the range of a taxon is suspected to be relatively circumscribed, if a considerable period of time has elapsed since the last record of a taxon, then the threatened status may be more justified. Circumscribed means restricted. Not applicable is a category for a taxa deemed to be ineligible for assessment at a regional level. Remember, we said that we classify from local level, national, regional, etc. So we have categories of taxa that are not applicable. So a taxon may be not applicable because it is not wild, okay, it's not a wild population, or it's not within its natural range in the region, or because it is a vagrant or a transient or taxon, like the way we have migration of certain animals within regions. So we cannot classify those at a regional level and say that this is their status or their conservation status, because at some point they will all leave and go to another place. Like the wild beast migration in Kenya, we cannot actually classify so much in terms of regional level their conservation status, because they keep moving from region to region. And then it may also be non-applicable because it occurs at very low numbers in the region, or the taxon will be classified at a lower taxonomic level than considered eligible for, yes, regional red list authority. So we also have thresholds of what is eligible. Okay, in contrast to other red list categories, it is not mandatory to use the non-applicable for all taxa to which it applies, but if it gives us certain information or it is informative, then it is recommended for us to label. Then we have what we call non-evaluated. Of course, this means we have not evaluated data, abundance, etc. and their distribution, and therefore cannot be given a criteria. So a taxon is not evaluated, and it has not yet been evaluated against the criteria A to E, as we shall be looking in the next few slides. So this is the criteria which is used for estimating extinction risk. So the International Union of Conservation of Nature red list characterizes all species, that is plants, animals, into various categories of risk of extinction. The goals of this listing is to provide scientifically based information on the status, which we are calling the conservation status at a global level, and then to draw attention to the magnitude and importance of threatened biodiversity, so that there should be actions of how we can conserve, and then of course influence national and international policy and decision makers depending on how they see the biodiversity using these criteria, and provide information to guide actions to conserve, yes, to conserve biological diversity. We had a qualitative since or until 1994. Qualitative means it doesn't give us numbers, it only gives us that these organisms are extinct, these ones are not. Then in 1994 we had the first quantitative now framework, and it was used for the 1996 red list. And then after the 1994 we had a revision of that framework in the 2000. So the basic framework for this 2000 model, of course, we have evaluated and non-evaluated. Okay, So evaluated those that we've been able to study against the criteria and those that have not been studied. Then for those that are evaluated, we have those that have adequate data. And remember we talked about data deficient category. And then for the adequate data, now we have the extinct, we had the extinct in the wild, critically endangered, vulnerable, near threatened, and least concern. So the threatened species, of course, here is the area where we have critically endangered considered to be facing extremely high, then endangered we said very high, then vulnerable high risk of extinction. So remember we are talking about estimating extinction risk. Okay, so the criteria we said is an A to E criteria, A to E criteria, and A stands for reduction in population size, B stands for small geographic range, then C stands for small population size and it's also declining, D stands for very small population size, then we have quantitative estimate of extinction risk. And this is how we are able to calculate, because we said we are mainly looking at extinction risk, which consists of critically endangered, and vulnerable. So we will give values to each of them as per the category. What for critically endangered, is there a reduction in population size? Is there a reduction? Then small is small geographic range, then we give a value. We use the system, we rank the species against each of the criteria. Note that there are separate thresholds for each criterion, and of course category of risk, then set the final category to the highest level of the risk. And this process has been computerized using what we are calling the RAMAS software that you can use even for land, for forest, for wild animals, etc. Criterion A, we do direct observation, then we give an index of abundance, then also check the decline in the area of occupancy, and the area of occupancy refers to quality of habitat, extent of occurrence or quality of habitat, then actual or potential levels of exploitation, and then effects of introduced taxa, maybe foreign taxa and pollutants. For past reductions, we have observed, estimated, inferred, or suspected reduction over 10 years or 3 generations of 90%, 70%, 50%, and causes ceased, understood, and reversible. We also have 80%, 50%, 30%, and causes not ceased, not understood, or may not be reversible. Then for future reductions, projected reduction over 10-year or 3 generation period of 80, 50, and 30% can include the past and the future. Reduction may not be ceased, not be understood, or may not be reversible. Geographic range is criterion number 2. The extent of occurrence less than, we check less than 100 kilometers squared, 5,000 kilometers squared, and 20,000 kilometers squared, and 2 of severely fragmented or at single location, critically endangered, then no more than 5 locations, that is for endangered, and no more than 10 locations, that is vulnerable. So you can see that if it's critically endangered, it is severely fragmented or at a single, just one location within those regions that extend either this or this. Then if you have just maybe 1 to 5, that is endangered. If you have 1 to 10, that is vulnerable. And of course you check continuing decline and of course extreme fluctuations within the geographic range. Then extent of occupancy less than, we also check extent of occupancy less than 10 kilometers squared, 500 kilometers squared, and 2002 sub-criteria. Then small size and declining criterion C, population size less than 250, 5,000, 10,000, and either you check continuing decline at least, that is 25% within 3 years or 1 generation, 20% within 5 years or 2 generations, 10% within 10 years or 3 generations. So if you check the decline, so if it is declining at 25%, that is critically endangered, 20% that is endangered, and this is vulnerable. Then you can also check continuing decline and no subpopulation larger than 50 or 250 or 1,000 individuals, at least 90, 95, and 100% of individuals in one subpopulation, and also check for extreme fluctuations. Then very small population size, if you just find 50 mature individuals, that's critically endangered. You find 250, that is endangered. If you find 1,000 mature individuals or very restricted area of occupancy less than 20 kilometers squared, or a number of locations that is 5 or less, that is vulnerable. Quantitative analysis, that is the probability of extinction in the world, at least 50% within 10 years. The probability of extinction, if it is 50% within 10 years or 3 generations, it's critically endangered. If it is 20% probability within 20 years or 5 generations, that is endangered. If it is 10% within 100 years, that is vulnerable. So this process, of course, we have said is automated, and it has also given us a success in many ways because it is very widely used internationally, and therefore we're able to have very good mapping of conservation status. Does not require so much data, and then generally easy to understand and to apply, and then can be applied across a wide range of tags, from insects to trees, etc. Now we also do have problems of this framework because of one specifying thresholds. Remember we talked about thresholds, like the way we are saying 10% here within 100 years. How do you specify this threshold? So specifying thresholds is of course roughly comparable. We do it roughly comparable, and that is why can be a challenge or a problem, because it is a rough estimate. And then the original intent was for the thresholds to be consistent with the E criterion, but it has changed over time. It is no longer consistent to this quantitative, so several things have changed with time. So we need to probably review this framework. And then the thresholds for A criterion in particular, and the use of inferred or suspected declines have been controversial, e.g. the listing of the Atlantic Code. So criterion A also, we have had several issues of decline estimates. How do you measure decline within a specific occurrence? And then we have problems with this framework because of fish. The 1996 red list, the quantitative criterion for the threatened categories may not be appropriate for assessing the risk of extinction in some species, particularly those that have high reproductive potential. If you have animals with high reproductive potential, they grow very fast and of course have broad geographic range. For example, the species within the oceans, they have such a broad geographic range, so it is difficult to assess their risk of extinction. Many of these species have high potential for population maintenance and high levels of mortality. Such species might form the basis for fisheries. So usually, like fish that live in the seas, we usually have them having a very high reproductive rate, yet they also have a high mortality rate. So using this criterion on some of these species may not be giving us the correct picture. Then of course, other problems with this framework is a decline criterion. Yes, we talked about that. How do you determine that this is the criterion for decline in a population? Then we have managed species issues. Then the long-lived species, 3 generations can be several thousands for some trees, because we have some trees that you may not really classify them in generations, because it will mean very many thousands of years. So you can see now applying for such can be difficult. Then should criterion E overrule the quantifying, the one that was saying 10% change within 100 years means a vulnerable population? The criteria are broad brush and should not overrule more sophisticated analysis. Of course, this is not the only way of analyzing conservation status. Many fish species would have been threatened or endangered at some time if we just use this criteria. So that's why we are saying that it is not it may not be the only way. We have other sophisticated analysis, and then how to incorporate precaution, and then no use of ecological knowledge. Those are some of the problems that we are facing with this framework. I just wanted to outline the IUCN. When you go to the website of IUCN, you will also find Kenya as part of it, because every nation or most nations have subscribed to this Conservation of Nature Union. So you're going to find certain information on Kenya and what we are doing with specific species and how we are doing conservation of specific substances. You can see the conservation of mar plastics, the Tana Delta. You can see Kenya arid lands. This is a website I want you to go and check. I have put links down here because it will help you look at some of the conservation assessment work that has been going on in Kenya and the eastern region. One way of managing conservation status is establishment and maintenance of reserves and national parks, which is something I gave you for discussion. We define nature reserve as an area set aside for purposes of preserving certain animals, plants, or even both. A nature reserve differs from a national park, usually because it's smaller and having as its sole purpose the protection of nature. Endangered species are often kept in reserves, away from the hunters who brought them close to extinction. In the United States, numerous wildlife refuges have served this purpose, especially with respect to birds. Then nature reserves are also numerous in, of course, Europe, India, Indonesia, and some African countries. You can see like this Komodo dragon here is in a reserve. National parks, on the other hand, is an area set aside by national government for preservation of the natural environment and may be set aside also for purposes of public recreation and enjoyment, or because it is historical or scientific interests are in that area. And most of the landscapes and the accompanying plants and animals in a national park are kept in their natural state. So they just enclose the area and leave the animals and the plants within their natural environment. For example, we have Amboseli National Park in Kenya. Then we have Yosemite National Park. And we also have Yukon National Park, which we'll also be seeing is also a corridor for very many species of birds. So we have what we call a wildlife corridor, which is a protected passageway where it is known that fauna migrate, or there is movement of fauna or various species of animals. The Yellowstone to Yukon conservation initiative is an excellent example of this type of conservation effort. So here we have various types of birds, like 105 species, and we have the migration of those birds within that area. In Kenya, we also have this in the East African region, where around April, May, and June, a vast army of wild beasts, along with other partners like zebras, elands, and gazelles, migrate around the western corridor of the Serengeti, south of Grumeti River. Of course, they migrate due to rainfall changes as they now move into the area where there is rainfall. And of course, that means assured vegetation for food. Then, according to conservation international programs, the term biodiversity refers to the richest and the most threatened reservoirs of plants and animal life on Earth. So if you hear a biodiversity hotspot, it refers to a place that is extremely rich, but of course also threatened reservoirs of plants and animals that we need to conserve. And to qualify as a hotspot, a region must meet two criteria. At least it must first contain at least 15,000 species of vascular plants, that is over 0.5% of the world's total. And then it has to have lost at least 70% of its original habitat for it now to be a threatened reservoir. These hotspots are rapidly disappearing, of course, due to human activities, but they can still have a chance of being saved if conservation measures are enacted. Biodiversity hotspots could be considered the most important places to put reserves, of course. Yes, and that is it on assessment of conservation status, as well as some of the management strategies that have been used in order to conserve these genetic and biodiversity resources.